The Restoration Colonies. Some characteristics about the Restoration Colonies. When we talk about the Restoration Colonies, we're talking about New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Delaware. Excellent land for farming. It was actually the first original bread colony. It was great for exports of grain. There's three main rivers, the Susquehanna, the Delaware, and the Hudson, which are wonderful for fur trade. It was less aristocratic than New England and the southern colonies, except for New York. New York had some pretty strong land holdings. Fewer industries in New England, more than the South. Shipbuilding was a big part of it, but commerce was a major force in that region too. And the population was more ethnically mixed. It was relatively religiously tolerant. It was democratically controlled, but there was some factions in those regions. There were some small groups who fought for power and control, and they result in some conflict when we focus on this region. So let's talk about New York. Little background about New York. The middle colonies, or the New York colony, um, the Dutch played a significant role in settling the region, um, especially right here through New Amsterdam. So the Dutch colonies, specifically around here, around New Amsterdam, um, and on the yellow, okay. You will have some English settlements up north, obviously, but the Dutch are definitely going to control the New York region. And this was a time period of, they call it the golden age of Dutch history. They were a major commercial and naval power. People don't really think about them much in regards to that. They did challenge England on the seas. There were three major Anglo-Dutch wars. There's going to be another Dutch and Spanish war that's actually going to allow England to solidify their region there as well and give them an opportunity to slide into there unbeknownst to the Spanish. But they were a major colonial power, in the East. Very, very, very significant and very wealthy. Um, Henry Hudson was the one who did discover and venture through Hudson Bay and did a fantastic job for the Dutch in establishing this region. Um, and the results could be the founding of New Netherlands. You know, Hudson, was an Englishman, but he was employed by the Dutch East River India Company, the Dutch East India Company. I think they said River Company. He sailed into Delaware and those bays in 1609 and made it all the way up to what's now the Hudson River. Um, but this area of New Netherlands was founded, and it was a company that was looking pretty much for the fur trade. They wouldn't pay much attention to the colony, but they were there for profit, solely for profit. They were not there to check anybody's expansion. It was there to make a profit. So when you talk about the purpose of New Netherlands, the purpose of the Dutch being in the New World, it's very similar to that of Virginia. They were there to make money. Manhattan, which is New Amsterdam, was actually purchased by the company for pennies per acre from the Indians. Another example of the exploitation of the Indians. But when you talk about New Amsterdam, that's why New Amsterdam is commonly referred to as New York City. It is New York City. Um, but the city was run by the Dutch company in the interest of stockholders. There was little religious toleration from the Dutch. Um, uh, they didn't care much about free speech, as we can talk about here in the next thing. It was a company town. Um, the governors were appointed by a company. It was very autocratic, and the religious dissenters in that region were definitely persecuted. But they did have a local assembly with some powers. Okay, and here's New Amsterdam. Much of the Dutch region was kind of made up of these things called patroonships. It was an aristocratic structure. It kind of resembled serfdom in a sense. They were huge estates, and they were granted to promote um, settlement. And basically, if you had 50 peoples on a settlement, you get your patroon. And some of them were actually larger than Rhode Island, for example. But after repeated protest, a semi-representative body was finally granted, and things changed a little bit in that region. But it was a cosmopolitan town, very diverse, huge population, different languages, and very much like today. like today in New York. And there's the patronship. So you can see look at the large areas granted. I mean, that's significant. All right, so basically, it was a very cosmopolitan area. Now,
Good morning, Kelton here. Your morning.
all right, sorry for the interruption. So, back to New Netherlands and New Sweden. There was some violence actually between the Indians and the Dutch. In reality, they actually built a wall to protect the Dutch. It's actually known as Wall Street today. But New Sweden was another area. In 1638, New Sweden was established. Swedes actually trespassed on Dutch lands in the Delaware River and set up their own little colony. However, in 1655, a Dutch force led by Peter Stuyvesant ended the Swiss rule, and essentially they're absorbed into the New Netherland region, but there still was a little Swiss background there. So in regards to that, the Dutch did have to fight to maintain that territory with conflicts with the native population, as well as that conflict with the Swedish. And there you have it. And that was actually the golden age of the Swedish colony founding. But there's Stuyvesant right there. And basically, it was a bloodless siege. Wasn't very difficult for the Dutch to do that. The Swiss weren't up for much of a fight. Now, here's where things change. And people always ask, at what point did it become New York? And here it is, very simply. New Netherlands becomes a British royal colony because Charles II, during the Restoration, comes back into power, and basically his brother, the Duke of York, he grants him land and territory. And as you guys read in the chapter from page 50 to 65, we talk a lot about how after the Restoration, the British Crown wanted to basically reward, Charles II especially, reward loyal, faithful servants with land in the colonies, and that's why they call them the Restoration colonies, because these colonies, it was a new period of colonization after the Restoration. There was a huge lull during that time period, prior to that time period, during the English Civil War, when there wasn't colonization anymore, and actually it wasn't as profitable. It's a long-term investment, so like the Virginia Company was losing money in a sense. But Charles II granted this territory to his brother, the Duke of York, and in 1664, the English arrived, the big navy, and the Dutch had little ammunition and not great defenses, and Stuyvesant was forced to surrender. But it was renamed New York, and now England gained a major, major harbor, and that was really important, really, really, really important. Now, one big thing that's going to change. The English are going to be much more religiously tolerant than the Dutch, and that's going to play a huge factor in how New York's made up now. So here's the original charter for the Duke of York, which contains parts of modern-day Connecticut and New Jersey. It's very extensive. There's New Amsterdam, 1664. Okay, and there is still a little bit of a Dutch residue in New York. The architecture, Brooklyn, Santa Claus, golf, waffles, thank God. But when you get back down to it, the Dutch did leave a bit of an imprint on New York, especially the whole cosmopolitan aspect of it. But New York does grant what they call a chapter of liberties. It granted all freedom of religion to all Christians. It did have some limitations. You had a lot of the land was in the hand of the few, so it was aristocratic, definitely. And it was very feudalistic. It was very similar, like back in England, much different than the rest of the different colonies there. And I think we mentioned that earlier. But it became a royal colony in 1685 when James II became king. And it flourished. It flourished under British rule. It really, really did. But it was autocratic. And it did have its problems, and we'll talk a little more about that when we come to some of the rebellions. Leisler's rebellion in New York City from 1689 to 1691 occurred in response to that, when Jacob Leisler, who was inspired by the Glorious Revolution, tried to overthrow the dominion of New England, and the revolt failed, but it does show that the rebellious nature of Americans and a response to a distant authority. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's go to Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, interesting story. When you think about Pennsylvania, you got to think about the Quakers. They were much like the Puritans in a sense. They opposed the Anglican Church. They refused to pay it with taxes. They don't like a paid clergy. They believed that all children were children of God. They refused to treat upper and lower class with deference. They kept their hats on. They addressed everybody as these and nows. They would not take oaths. They were pacifists. Basically, they believed in equality. Men and women could both reside over a church. So there's a lot of equality in that region. Now, the founder of that region is going to be William Penn. It's kind of a sad story. He's an aristocratic Englishman, attracted to the Quaker faith. He inherited a great deal of money from his father's passing, and he received a grant from the king to establish the colony. It was a debt owed to his father. But he did a great job of marketing Pennsylvania as a liberal land. It attracted many immigrants, and it's kind of similar to the idea of Rhode Island, but the Quakers were very tolerant. The Quakers worked very, very well with the native population. They dealt peacefully with the Indians. It was huge, in a sense, how they dealt with the Indians. Because you can see here that they didn't take land. They essentially treated the natives with respect. However, here's the big issue, and it's really, really important, and I'll highlight it here. As non-Quakers started coming in, though, to Pennsylvania, they did not have the same relationship with the native population. They actually treated the natives poorly, so that could cause some tension on the frontier, which will, when we talk about rebellions, that'll come up again. Okay, but Penn had a treaty with the Native Americans, and they call it the Society of Friends, the Quakers, and a lot of people refer to Pennsylvania as the Great Holy Experiment. There was religious toleration, which is a huge basis in American government today. I think that's really, really important. Pennsylvania society, a little restrictive in some way. It had many different people there. However, there was no taxes for military defense, no restrictions on immigration, no slavery. There were sumptuary laws, or blue laws, which were against stage plays, cards, dice, gambling, excessive hilarity. And that's very similar to like some laws that we have in America today against gambling or against things like prostitution, or anything to kind of control the morality. But however, there was great civil liberty and religious freedom, which is a huge connection between modern United States and Pennsylvania. Okay, so you had Swedes, Finns, the Dutch, you name it, English. It was really, and eventually becomes the fourth largest colony behind Virginia, Maryland, and Massachusetts. And the Quakers were good businessmen too. They were really good businessmen. As you can see, Pennsylvania was laid out in a very nice structured way. Philadelphia, the capital, was in a grid-like pattern, laid out in a nice way. It was a great place for commerce and a great place to live. It attracted a large German population too, but they did great business. And as you can tell, Pennsylvania is growing here exponentially. I mean, take a look. By 1775, Philadelphia is the most largely populated city in the future United States. So it says a lot. They did a great job recruiting people. It was a wonderful, wonderful colony. So those are the two big ones, the middle colonies, the Restoration. We'll talk a little bit more about Georgia and New Jersey and the Carolinas in class. So have a wonderful night.